Dear all, I would like to warmly welcome everyone to this IPBES webinar on the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services Scenarios-Based Model in Intercomparison, or BES-SIM for short. This webinar is organized by the IPBES Task Force on Capacity Building in collaboration with the Task Force on Scenarios and Models. My name is Ingunn Storo, and I'm the head of the IPBES Technical Support Unit on Capacity Building. We have around 1 hour today where we will hear more about BES-SIM from Dr. Enrique Pereira and Ms. Hye-Jin Kim before we have time for some questions. And you can ask a question through the Q&A function, and you can also upvote a question you would like answered. Dr. Enrique Pereira is a professor at Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany, and leads the Biodiversity Conservation Group at IDIV German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research. He is the former co-chair and a current member of the IPBES Scenarios and Models Task Force. Mrs. Hye-Jin Kim is a doctoral candidate at Martin Luther University in Halle, Germany, where she will soon be defending her dissertation on nature futures scenarios. She is a researcher at IDIV German Center for Integrative Biodiversity Research and a fellow of the IPBES Scenarios and Models Task Force. Dr. Pereira and Ms. Kim, together with several colleagues, including Drs. Paul Ledley, Rob Alkemade, Isabel Rosa and Ines Martinez, co-led and co-coordinated the BES-SIM study. So now we know a bit about those who will be presenting, but let's do a quick dive into who is in the audience. So far, we have close to 250 participants with us, and people are still joining. So we have all regions represented here, so a good mix of people in the audience. So now we know a bit more about who is in this webinar. So without further ado, I'll hand over to my colleague Claire Jacobs in the Scenarios and Models Technical Support Unit, who will be facilitating the session on BES-SIM. Claire, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ingunn. So my name is Claire Jacobs. I'm part of the Technical Support Unit for Scenarios and Models, and I'm based in Wageningen, the Netherlands. Happy to see that you have joined with so many. I will be hosting this session this afternoon, and I propose we get started right away because we have very interesting talks ahead of us. I'd like to get started by giving the floor to the presenters. First, a question for Henrique. If you could please elaborate a little bit to what has led to the BES-SIM study. The floor is yours, Henrique.
Good morning, or good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. It's really an honor to be here with you today and to present a bit of the work that has been catalyzed by the IPBES expert group on scenarios and models, and later the task force on scenarios and models. This is work from many people and a much larger group than me and Hye-Jin that had a relatively small role in what was really a collective work. And we already heard some of the key people that played a major role in this study. So let me then go to address your question, Claire, on what led to the BES-SIM study. And I wanted to start by explaining a bit what are scenarios or how we are interpreting scenarios here. So scenarios are representations of possible futures for one or more components of a system, for instance, for the drivers of change under alternative policy options. And scenarios can provide an effective means of addressing the relationships between nature benefits to people, and good quality of life. And here in the figure, you have an adaptation of the IPBES conceptual framework with the drivers, their impacts on nature, and the relationship between nature and nature benefits to people, and then how it affects quality of life, and how our understanding of the links between these different components uses models, and how we use scenarios to compare different policy options in terms of what we can do in terms of direct drivers, indirect drivers, and governance of socio-ecological systems. It's important to understand that models play a key role in scenarios, although it's not the only way of making scenarios. And the reason why models often play a key role is that it's a way of integrating data and allows us to translate different policy options into projected consequences for nature and nature benefits to people. So we can examine if a policy is implemented doing A, what are the consequences for nature and for nature contributions to people in comparison to, let's say, policy B, or in contrast to, let's say, not doing anything. And so this kind of exercise are important in the policy cycle, where scenarios may have a key role in promoting a dialogue between the stakeholders, between policymakers and experts on how we expect socio-ecological systems to evolve under different policies. And so scenarios really are a tool for dialogue where models can play an important role on the projections. Now, in 2016, the BES methodological assessment on biodiversity ecosystem services was published, and it made several important points. One was that no single set of scenarios and models can address all pertinent spatial and temporal scales, and that are being assessed for EPES and for the study of dynamics of socio-ecological systems. And so there is a need to link multiple scenarios and models dealing with drivers of proposed policy interventions operating at different scales. And because this is such a challenge thing to do, the platform, this methodological assessment stated that the platform may want to consider encouraging and working closely with the wider scientific community to develop a flexible and adaptable suite of multi-scale scenarios specifically tailored to the objectives of EPES, because until then, or until recently, we didn't have really scenarios that were tailored specifically for the nature and nature contributions to people. And this is what the platform did. The platform established the EPES expert group on scenarios and models that is now continuing to the task force since 2019. And with one of the goals was exactly to catalyze the development of scenarios and associated models by the broader scientific community for the future work of the platform. And in our first meeting in IDIV in Leipzig in 2016, we came up with a road plan on how to do this in the long run. And the road plan had two steps. The first step was urgent need of having something ready for the first global assessment of EPES. And that led to BES-SIM, where we used the existing scenarios, the SSPs and the RCPs that have been developed mainly for the climate community originally. And we used those scenarios to look at their implications for biodiversity and ecosystem services. At the same time, we said that in the long run, for the future, we wanted to develop a new generation of scenarios centered in nature, about positive visions of nature, called the nature futures, that we'll talk a bit more a little later. But today we're going to focus mainly on this first exercise, the BES-SIM exercise that we did for the global assessment. And there we brought together, as asked, as requested by the plenary, we brought together several modeling teams around the world, from Japan to North America, to work in harmonizing the projections of the consequences of different scenarios for biodiversity and ecosystem services. This was the Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services scenario-based intermodal comparison, and it was the first exercise of its kind. And what was the question we addressed exactly? Well, we have scenarios of land use change that have been developed in the context of the SSPs, the so-called shared socioeconomic pathways, and we have scenarios of climate change. What do those scenarios mean for biodiversity and ecosystem services or nature contributions to people? And these scenarios reflect underlying drivers and policy choices. What will happen to the demographic growth over the 21st century? What will happen to the distribution of wealth? What will happen to lifestyles and diets? What will happen to CO2 emissions? All of these issues are mapped into these broad scenarios that allow us to contrast what will be the likely consequences of different policy choices and societal choices.
Thank you, Henrik, for providing this background and a bit of rationale for the study. For the second part of our presentation that is now going to start, I would like to give the floor again to the presenters, in this case to Hejin. And I would like to ask you if you could tell us a bit more about how the BES-SIM study was done. Please, Hejin, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Claire.
I'll try. Okay, try.
So, as Henrik mentioned, we brought experts in scenarios and models for biodiversity, ecosystem services, and climate scenarios, as well as integrable system models, and to do this exercise for the BES-SIM. And we used representative concentration pathway scenarios combined with the shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios as input for the simulations. And we came together and selected 3 sets of scenarios. One is the SSP1, which is the global sustainability scenario with the lowest greenhouse gas concentration, forcing at 2.6, which represents moderate land use pressure and low level of climate change. And the second set combines SSP3, which is known as regional rivalry scenario, with RCP 6.0, which represents high land use pressure with moderately high level of climate change. And the third set is the SSP5 scenario, which is fossil fuel pathway with RCP 8.6, which is the highest level of greenhouse gas concentration. This represents medium land use pressure and very high level of climate change. And we had mainly 4 time steps to 1900 going backwards a century. And we had present at 2015. And we had 2 future time points, 2050 and 2070, that we used for the analysis purpose. And we had 3 simulations. One is land use only, and we kept the climate change constant from the present. And then we had climate change simulation, which kept the land use change to 2050 constant. And then we had one final third simulation where we combined land use and climate change together. And in this slide, you will see on the upper layer, the changes in cropland from 2015 to 2050. And so the the changes, the expansion of cropland would be in blue, and the extraction or decrease in cropland in red. So what you see in the SSP5 and SSP3 scenarios are greater change or expansion of cropland than SSP1 scenario, which is global sustainability scenario. And then on the bottom row, you see the global maps of temperature change for the 3 RCP scenarios. And what you see here is the greater change in temperature, so rising temperature in RCP 8.6 compared to the other 2 RCP scenarios. And using this input data coming from climate scenarios and land use scenarios of RCP and SSP scenarios, we used 10 biodiversity models and 6 ecosystem functions and services models grouped into species, community, ecosystem, and ecosystem functions and services. 15 models of these required land use data, and 30 models used climate data. And these models had different approaches to how biodiversity and ecosystem services respond to land use change and climate change in terms of statistical approaches, and how they integrate spatial and temporal dynamics. And these models also had different taxonomic and functional groups. And in the case of ecosystem services and NCPs, we had different also metrics and units that we could only categorize into different NCPs. We used 3 metrics for biodiversity as an output after the simulation of these scenarios. One on extinction as change in species richness. Another one on change in suitable habitat for species across these species, and abundance-based intactness. And we used, we had these metrics at the local level in the grid cell, and we aggregated this to the regional level at the IPBES region and sub-regional level, and we also aggregated this at the global level to see the global trends. And we used the nature's contributions to people classification published by the IPBES community, and had 7 metrics on regulating NCPs, including pollination, climate regulation, water quantity and quality, soil protection, hazards, and detrimental organisms. And we had 3 on material NCPs. So that's bioenergy, food and feed, and materials such as wood harvest. And this BES-SIM exercise led to several publications in different journals, including what you see here and more. And they capture the results of the individual model-based results. And the synthesis of this BES-SIM model intercomparison that Anike will present next has informed the IPBES Global Assessment Chapter 4, and also was highlighted in the summary for policymakers.
Okay, thank you very much, Hye-Jin, for explaining on the scenario selection and the general approaches that have been used. It would be good to know that this presentation will be shared with you afterwards, so you can further investigate things for yourself later on. Now, I think the audience would be very curious to know about the findings and results of the study. So I'd like to give the floor to Henrique. Could you please tell us a bit more on what the BES-SIM study did find out? Please go ahead.
Yes, I think we are all curious to know about the main results. And let's start by saying that, as Hye-Jin mentioned, that we also looked at the historical trends. So we to put into context the scenarios into the future, we look also to the past. We look back to 1900. And the first question, maybe the first question that comes to mind is, what is happening to global species richness? And the news are not good. We have been losing species globally. According to this analysis, around 1% of the species have been lost over the 20th century. And the bad news is that it looks like in the range of scenarios that have been explored will continue to lose species, not except, but at a lower rate, however, at a lower rate in SSP1, that is the more sustainable scenario that has several policy, let's say, options and societal developments that put less pressure on nature. Now, how does this look across other metrics? Very similar. So just look now at panel B here. If you look at panel B, and the top left, we have the delta S, the total species extinctions at the regional level. It's called gamma diversity at the global level, I'm sorry. Then we have delta S alpha is what you observe if you are at a place, the average extinctions locally. It's different from global because a species can go extinct locally without going extinct globally. And there can also be colonizations where some species can come in and you cannot have really colonizations at the global level. There's a bit of speciation, but it's, let's say, negligible at these time scales. So despite that, we still find that despite that there can be colonizations at the local level, we still find in our analysis that there is, in average, a decline of species richness at the local level. So it's not only the global level, it's also happening at the local level. And this, of course, has very serious implications for ecosystem function. The signal is even more clear when we look at the changes in area of suitable habitat for species. There, the declines are even more substantial, or when you look at intactness, that takes into account not only if the species is present, but changes in abundance in relation to a baseline. So all of these metrics are telling us that things are getting worse and historically, and the only scenario where things may get better, for instance, for intactness, that is the metric on the bottom, is the global sustainability scenario, SSP1. So there's a bit of a light in the end of the tunnel. There's a bit of hope that one of the scenarios would be better. But this is just if we consider land use change. When you look at climate change, and that's the bottom right panel, is looking at the climate change at the same set of metrics, also in historical and in the three scenarios. What we see is that we are in for an acceleration of species extinctions, loss of area of suitable habitat across species, and reduction of intactness across the board, but particularly for the scenarios with more climate change and land use change. Again, the SSP1, as we paired it with the climate change scenario with less climate change, this is RCP 2.6, is the less it's the less negative scenario for biodiversity. In reality, by some standard, by at least one of the metrics, could even be slightly better than the historical what has happened in the last century. But as we start going to scenarios with more climate, as we start going to scenarios that go to 4 degrees, the SSP4, SSP 3, RCP 6 that goes to 4.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels, or even RCP 8 that goes to 6-7 degrees above pre-industrial levels, then you're in for major biodiversity losses over this century. So the message here is that we have to be concerned about reducing land use change, but also climate change, as climate change becomes more and more important. And where is this happening? Well, around the world. So in the top, we're looking just at the land use impacts. And you see that this is very heterogeneous. There is less impact, as I mentioned, in the global sustainability scenario, SSP1, more in the regional rivalry, that is SSP3, and fossil fuel development, that is SSP5. Although the patterns are slightly different of where this is happening. We see a lot of challenges for Africa in regional rivalry and a lot of challenges for Southeast Asia and South America in the fossil fuel development. So there is slightly different patterns of biodiversity loss in these two more negative scenarios. When you add climate change, things get really bleak. Again, with things being slightly better, slightly less bleak in the global sustainability scenario, but very, very bleak both in the regional rivalry and the fossil fuel development, as we have also these interactions between climate change and land use change that drive biodiversity loss. So by all means, we want to stay on the left-hand side, or even better than what is in this left-hand side scenario. We certainly don't want to go to the middle or the right. What about ecosystem services? Well, here the story is much more complex, because if you look at historically what has happened is that we have increased provisioning services such as food and feed production, timber production. That has a historical pattern when you look at what has happened in the last few decades from 1900 to today. But this has been at the cost of regulating services such as pollination, such as nitrogen retention, such as ecosystem carbon. And so there has been a trade-off between sacrificing regulation services, sacrificing sustainability in the long run to produce more ecosystem goods for people. And the question is, can we get away from this trade-off for the next few decades? And the answer is, depends on scenario. In the regional rivalry and fossil fuel development scenarios, we are going to continue on this trend, and this is going to be even to some extent exacerbated. The global sustainability scenario, where some very different policy options are done, gives us, again, signs of hope that we could, in reality, have some improvements across several ecosystem services, regulating ecosystem services, even at the same time as we continue to increase the production of goods or material ecosystem services. How is this pattern spatially? Again, look at where we have major trade-offs, particularly in the bottom figure here. That is the, let's say, the worst scenario of all, with more climate and a lot of land use change. You have many regions of the world, in Africa, in South America, in Asia, where you have loss of biodiversity. You have increases in material NCPs, but always at the cost of regulating NCPs. And these trade-offs are not there, or are much more minimized in the global sustainability scenario. So what are the take-home message from here? Well, biodiversity is declining globally. This is clear across a range of metrics, but the impacts from land use change are not accelerating in the next few decades. Instead, climate change will become increasingly important. We have been degrading biodiversity and regulating services to increase material services, but there are development pathways that minimize this trade-off in this future. Although the current set of scenarios, for instance, the global sustainability scenario that is more positive for biodiversity ecosystem services, has several policy and societal developments that are positive, such as reduced demographic growth, such as transition to more healthy diets, such as more equal distribution of wealth around the world, and the adoption of technologies that allow to mitigate climate change and reduce carbon emissions, there could still be scenarios out there that are even better than this global stability scenario. And so these scenarios, we didn't put all the policies in place that can protect biodiversity in the coming decades. And that will take us into what we can do in the future to analyze even more policies that put biodiversity at the core, at the center of those policies, so that we can even do better than what is in the global sustainability scenario. That is some questions that we'd like to examine in the future.
Could you please provide a bit of an outlook, take us a bit into the near future, on what do you suggest as next steps for scenarios of biodiversity and ecosystem services? The floor is yours again.
Thank you, Claire. So as you may still remember from my first few slides, the roadmap for the development of scenarios tailored for BES had two steps. The first was very urgent, the BES-SIM exercise with the SSPs and RCP scenarios, what was available in terms of scenarios at the time. So socioeconomic scenarios at the time for land use and climate, to be in time, ready in time for the BES global assessment. But then we felt that these were not sufficient, as I mentioned in my last slide, is that they don't put nature at the center of the policies, and they don't deploy the range of policies that are possible to improve the future of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So at the same time we started BES-SIM, in the expert group, we started promoting and working with the community on a new set of scenarios centered in nature that we have named the nature futures. And the idea is that these nature futures would allow us to work at different scales. It would be much more multi-scale, so from local knowledge with participatory scenarios to regional assessments to global scenarios. And there will be linking nature with ecosystem services, our nature contributions to people and society, and looking at these socio-ecological feedback loops between these different components of the systems. And the idea is that we would examine these different positive visions, and they will be normative in terms of establishing positive visions with different perspectives about how nature should be managed. And we will do that in different regions and in different sectors. So this was kind of the original roadmap. And this is what we have been doing over the last 5 years in the task force and the expert group on scenarios and models. And this all started with a big visioning exercise that we had in New Zealand, where we brought together stakeholders from all over the world to discuss what should be positive visions for the future of nature. And we had artists. It was an amazing workshop with artists also representing these visions. And what we came to realize after analyzing the results of this workshop is that there are many, many dimensions of these preferences of people for the future of nature, many dimensions. But they kind of can be simplified into 3 main axes. Nature for nature, that emphasizes the ideas of intrinsic values for nature, existence values of nature, the space for nature itself. Nature for society, that expresses the utilitarian view of nature, the importance of nature for people in terms of nature contributions to people, in terms of ecosystem services. And a very important but often neglected perspective that is nature as culture, that in reality, it doesn't make that much sense to separate people and nature, people are part of nature, and nature are part of people. We shape nature through, for instance, cultural landscapes, and nature shapes us. And what we realized in this work is that we can, each of us probably will have different emphasis of these different perspectives. Some may be more attracted to the idea of nature for nature, others nature for society, others nature as culture, but they are all positive. They can all coexist and represent different preferences of different communities of people. So we are starting to build now these positive scenarios in nature futures. This is, for instance, in a recent paper done by several colleagues from an urban synthesis working group at SDIV. And this is how cities could look like, for instance, with the three perspectives. Of course, all the cities will have all these three perspectives, but this allows us to illustrate the differences and on these three perspectives, on kind of, in terms of land planning options that you may do in the city, and other regulatory choices and lifestyle choices, and how they all have something good for the people and for nature when you follow these kind of visions and values.
So having presented you the BES-SIM results and the nature pictures a little bit in a snapshot, what are some of the ways forward for us? We think that we need to start combining this, developing scenarios combining the nature pictures framework, which diversifies the value perspectives on nature, and also increase the biodiversity and human-nature relationship a little more at the center of the scenarios, together with the SSP scenarios that we presented today as part of the BES-SIM exercise. And the potential there is that the SSP1 scenario, which is a global sustainability scenario, could really go in extension and in extension to see how we could find those multiple pathways to more sustainability scenarios. And there we want to see, as Enrique mentioned, how these scenarios could really be implemented or used at different scales and also sectors. As you see on the right side of this slide, we have a very complex human nature coupled socio-ecological system. This is just using a framework called DIPSAR. But what we see here is that a lot of interventions that we make at the institutional or human individual level, it impacts various drivers that drive also the pressures on nature, and that also in fact impacts different dimensions of state of nature, including biodiversity and other dimensions that really impact human at the societal level. So one is, how do we expand and broaden the range of drivers that we use in modeling beyond climate and land use? And also another aspect is, how do we really see how that drivers impact biodiversity, but also impact the ecosystem services or nature's contributions that the people that we receive as humans, and then how that affects human well-being, and ideally how those impact level information at the human and societal level informs back the decisions that institutions and individuals make to really improve the situation. And we believe that it's really important that we look at the positive drivers of change as much as we have seen the negative drivers of change for biodiversity and people, and really diversifying the indicators to include more benefits and value perspectives on nature, so that we also capture the cultural and personal values that we co-create between nature and people, and really make those diverse dimensions of biodiversity and value perspectives more explicit in the decision-making context. And there has been a lot of efforts ongoing in the biodiversity modelers and data realm. So we have been trying really hard to standardize the the biodiversity and ecosystem services data using the essential variables framework, and we're moving towards the NetCDF standardization, where you can actually bring this very multi-layer, time-wise, entity-wise, scenarios-wise information in one package, so that the analysis is easier and the production of indicators is much easier from the user side. And to finish, some of the ongoing and upcoming activities from the BES Scenarios and Models Task Force. We are continuing to catalyze the modeling efforts to operationalize the nature future scenarios. And there are two events that's coming up. And one is the Forum on Scenarios for Climate and Societal Futures. And this is the forum where a lot of developers and applying scientists gather on discussing how the shared socioeconomic pathway scenarios have been working and how we can move forward. And this summer, there will be a presentation in the plenary of this session on the scenarios for EPES assessments. And there is also a session, and there are actually many sessions on biodiversity and ecological scenarios and modeling, including one on catalyzing climate and biodiversity coupled scenarios for assessments and policy. So we hope that there will be some more dialogue going between biodiversity and climate scientists. And then there's another one just before the EPES plenary, the World Biodiversity Forum. There also we will have a presentation on the Nature Futures Framework that Enrique presented shortly. And then a session on challenges and opportunities for using this new framework, presenting various case studies coming from different regions, ecosystems, and also across the scale. So we hope that these activities will really help reaching broader scientific communities in applying the new framework and see how we can go forward in developing more sustainability and nature and people positive scenarios going forward. So with that, we thank you for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hejin and Henrik, for providing a bit of an outlook and sharing some inspiring perspectives. We've come to the end of the presentation, and it's now, I think we have about 10 minutes left to answer some questions. We do invite you, the participants, to put your questions in the Q&A chat, which you will find in the bottom of your screen. There have already been inserted quite a lot of questions. Some of these questions have already been answered, I think, by the presentation itself. But please go ahead and drop your questions there. There's also the option to vote for questions. So if you see a similar question, please vote for that one. And there is a bigger chance of being picked up by the presenters. We'd like to start first with one question that was already submitted by you participants upon registration. We've checked your questions and we found a few similar questions. So we think that represents a general interest. So we'd like to start with that question. So I'd like to ask the presenters if you can say a little bit, how can scenarios inform decision-making across the different scales? Seems to be a large interest in knowing a bit more on how this can support decision-making. Please, could you answer this question?
Would you like to go?
You go ahead.
So the scenarios and models can be very useful, as Enrique mentioned in the beginning of the presentation. And just as an example, more concretely, you can think of, for instance, the CBD Global Biodiversity Framework and its implementation at the national level. It has a global biodiversity framework that sets the goals for the global community with countries involved. You can set, you can use exploratory scenarios or target setting scenarios to determine the future goals or milestones for the global target on various drivers or interventions or the state of nature that you want. And then at the national level, you can take this really and then design different policies. So what will get us to reach the target, and also examine different conservation options and project their impact on biodiversity and human well-being. And then you can, and then that can also be disaggregated at the very local spatial planning level to see what spatial configuration that you can have for instance, on protected area designation or
city planning.
Yeah, city planning.
Yep.
And then I think also importantly, it's really key that we look at how these implemented policies have really progressed or performed so that we know what is effective and what is not. And there is a real opportunity for at least CBD and its implementation at the national and local level. How do we connect these future trajectories with how that's progressing retrospectively? So there's also an opportunity there of using the models to see how the forecasting can be supported in determining the future planning, and also using the same models and data sets and potential indicators to see how that goals have been met over time. So I think that answers a little bit.
I think so too. I think it does. Thank you very much. We do have some 5 minutes left for answering questions that are being posed in the Q&A chat. So I think the question to the presenters, if they like to pick out a few of those questions.
So I'll go by maybe the ones that are most voted, I guess.
Indeed. Yes,
so there is a question on the existing network for green financial sector work. We don't have at this moment a direct connection to them, but we know about the work. I'm wondering if the anonymous attendee could write us an email either to me or Eugene after this meeting, so that we could follow up and follow a way of collaborating there. I think it will be important to establish a collaboration, because I think this is really important work. As much of the scenario work is important to assess risks for the financial sector and also the better investments in the future. There is a second question on what if we ask, if we will identify the actions flagged for real world action. The SSPs are a bit exploratory, identifying just one. They are a complex narrative with many components. It's hard to identify just one action, and that's something we are that is slightly different with these more normative scenarios, nature futures, where we're looking at specific actions and are better able to flag those actions that are more urgent. That's harder with the approach of the SSPs and RCPs that tell you broader stories about the trends in different indirect drivers. And how are these surprises taken into account? Well, we have a lot of, you saw a lot of error bars in the models, for instance, and I didn't focus so much on that today, but there is certainly very large uncertainty about some of these projections. We're still confident of overall the conclusions that we presented today, but one of the goals is to continue to refine the modeling work to reduce the differences between the model projections that we have now that are significant and are really, let's say, a task for the scientific community to improve on their models. And this really relates a bit to the question from William Speller on how sophisticated this suite of models is indeed relatively sophisticated, but although a couple of the models are relatively simple, so it goes from very complex process-based models to phenomenological models that are relatively simple to use. Some of them are already being used in many other contexts. For instance, one of the models that was part of BES-SIM was the INVEST. INVEST is available open source. There are manuals, there are trainings, and to model ecosystem services mainly. And so there is a lot of work from the Natural Capital Project in making the INVEST available. Globio is another model very important model, an integrated assessment model, and the team at PBL has also worked a lot in capacity building and supporting the use of GloBio in assessments around the world. And there are more models showing up or being developed every year, and this community is becoming larger. And that's one of my hopes, is that in the future, if we continue this work with the Nature Futures, we'll have more models and a range of models from, let's say, the global to the local level that can be used. And before, I think we are almost out of time, but I saw a question from an old friend, Zoltan Koen. I hope you are doing well, Zoltan. Miss not seeing you for a while. And I wanted to say that in terms of the socio-ecological system, the question is, I think, let's see if what you mean by socio-ecological model is this idea that it's not only nature, it's always nature and people. And so that's why we talk about socio-ecological models. There's a social, there's ecological component, but they apply to the agricultural landscapes, and they apply also to, let's say, more natural or less human-dominated landscapes, more pristine or more or wilder landscapes. I'm very keen on wilderness and rewilding too, as Zoltan. And so it applies to a range, but we have to always have in mind that whatever options we make about nature, ultimately it's people making options about nature. So the socio-ecological component and dynamic is always there.
Thanks. And I think we are reaching almost the end of the webinar time. Is it possible to make a last comment or pick out one last question before we close?
Do you want to pick one? Yeah.
If you like, or perhaps a closing comment.
So maybe a closing comment, because I think a lot of questions that came were very relevant actually for the presentation, but it's also speaking how the audiences are also interested in taking part. So we've informed you about some of the planned activities going forward, but I think it will be really useful if you took some time to read some of the manuscripts or the papers that's been published through the task force on Nature Futures framework and the BES-SIM exercise, and some of the lessons learned from the BES-SIM, and hopefully more forthcoming on applied Nature Futures case studies, so that you also learn how these are being applied at different regional scale, different ecosystems, different sectors even, and then see how you can engage and also contribute from other practitioners or researchers or just stakeholders' point of view. And we really want to mobilize the global community, regardless of your background, to really engage in developing the new scenarios that is more positive for nature and people. So,
thank you very much. I would like to ask to thank Henrik and Hejin very much for your presentation, sharing your thoughts and your experiences, and also in taking time to answer the questions. I'm afraid we won't be able to answer all the questions, so we will think of a way to address them later on. I also would like to thank the audience to show up with so many. Please stay connected and keep an eye on the IBES events that are upcoming in the IBES website. I'd like to give the floor back to Ingun, please, for the closure.
Thank you, Claire. Thank you all for joining us here today and submitting a lot of relevant questions. Big thank you also to Claire for facilitating, and of course, Enrique and Hejin for their very informative presentation and answers. We hope this webinar met your expectations. We would really appreciate if you could answer just 2 last questions before leaving. They should pop up on your screen. And with that, I would like to thank you all for joining. And thank you and goodbye.
And I just saw a question while people are answering. Yes, there is also ongoing work for the sea. We are also planning for the Nature Futures. There is the Fish Me project from the climate change community and the fisheries community, and some marine biologists, but we are bringing all it together again, all together in the Nature Futures work that we are planning.